everybody. This is Pastor Brady Henderson, the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church located in the Midlands of South Carolina, First Baptist Church of Gaston, that is. And we're here today for the 33rd episode of the Menorah podcast. Today is Thursday, September the 19th. I hope this podcast is finding you well. And Alan, we're already halfway through September, and it's really, really hard to believe. Weather's starting to get a little chilly, not much, just a little. But we're already here, third Thursday in September.
Time is moving really fast. It is good to see things cooling down a little bit. You're kind of starting to see this changing of the seasons now. Some of your trees are starting to lighten up a little bit, and days are getting shorter.
Yep, time change is coming soon. And so for the 33rd episode of the Menorah podcast today, of course, for those who are regular listeners, you know the goal of this podcast is to speak the light, send the light, and share the light of Jesus Christ all across the airwaves of the internet. And so what we want to talk about today on the 33rd episode is I'm actually going to take a back seat today, and Alan is going to drive our episode, and he's going to talk a little bit. And Alan, I'm going to let you open it up and let you talk a little bit about what we're going to be discussing today.
Yeah, this is kind of a treat for me because now I get to ask questions that you have no idea what I'm going to ask.
So for 32 episodes, you've had to sit on the other side, and now for one episode, I don't know what's going on. I'll be honest with you, I don't know the questions until they pop in my head.
Well, I want to paint a visual picture as we sit here doing it. I'm in a T-shirt and just a pair of khakis, and Pastor Brady is pretty dressed up over there. He's in a shirt and tie, a white shirt and tie, I might add, and his long sleeve shirt. That's pretty formal. So, and all of that is because he has a revival this evening at a church fairly close by, and I kind of wanted to delve into that a little bit and get some thoughts on exactly how do you prepare for something like that, knowing that, folks ask pastors to do that. Mm-hmm. Usually they've heard something about the pastor or, their local. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that as a invitation? Yeah. And how do you go about preparing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really glad we're kind of diving into this. I haven't found any resources on this, so I'm hoping this could be a help to other pastors. So to kind of start it off, and I'm going to have several answers for you here, and if you need me to get back on track, you just let me know. But I think the first thing is we need to understand and realize that people don't have revival services or Bible conferences or whatever you want to call them like they used to. It is not like it used to be, and one reason I don't host them very often, of course we did this year, and we might wait a few more years until we do it again, is because I fall under the category of believing you should have a revival service every time you come into church. When other churches call them revivals, that's fine. I prefer the term Bible conference. I used revival this year. It's a little bit different with homecoming and kicking off our building program, but they don't happen as much. And so it used to be, and this is a very interesting thing, but it used to be in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, that you would ask your preacher friends to do the revivals for you. And that still exists. That still happens. But it's very rare that you have the same speaker for the whole week, which is what I'm doing this week. And so Bennett Samaria Baptist Church all week, every night. So that's pretty rare. Now, I do several of those a year usually. What's most common is you do like a one-nighter. So this upcoming Monday, they're having a 3-night Bible conference, but it's a different speaker every night. And so I'm doing Monday night. Another guy's doing Tuesday. Another guy's doing Wednesday. And so that's kind of how that goes. And so, and that's in Anderson this coming Monday. And then on October the 6th, I'll be doing a homecoming service. So there's really three kinds, right? A week-long revival, maybe a one-night thing, or doing a homecoming for another church. So before I answer the other part of your question, any question about the three different kinds?
The thing that comes to mind is it different to prepare? How different is it to prepare for a multi-night? I, personally think it would be easier to do multi-night than it would be just a one-off.
Yeah, it is. And for those that know my preaching style, one-offs for me are terrible. I'm just not good at one-offs. I'm a continuity guy. I'm a build upon the scripture kind of thing. And so, like a 3 night like I'm doing this week, obviously in my preaching arsenal, and let me preface it with this: unless the Lord directs me to, I usually don't prepare new sermons for revivals. I have a preaching arsenal, so to speak, which isn't very large because I haven't been preaching very long. But for me personally, I'll kind of walk through how I've prepared for Samaria this week. So their pastor has actually asked me to come 3 years in a row. This is the fourth time he's asked me. And by the way, he's the interim there. Just found out they are calling a new pastor this coming Sunday. He's coming for a trial sermon. And so when I found out that information, the Lord really pressed upon my heart. What are three things that you would want the congregation to be prepared for a new pastor? And so as I prayed about it, when I do a week-long revival, for example, one time I did a week-long revival, I came out of Haggai the whole week. Or I try to stay in the same book. One time I did Philemon at a senior adult conference I did. And so this week I decided to come out of Titus. Now, when we went through Titus at First Baptist, I pulled 7 sermons out of that. Okay, I only have 3 nights. So what I do is I picked 3 that were similar to one another that I could build upon. So Monday night of this week, I did Committed to Serving from the first 4 verses in chapter 1 of Titus. Tuesday night, I preached on being committed to the gospel, which is in Titus chapter 2. And then last night, I wrapped it up with being committed to spirit-led living from Titus chapter 3. So I pull, it's still expository because I'm pulling from the text. I don't do topical even when I do those kind of messages. But those were the 3 kind of things from Titus that I felt like that church needed as they prepared for a new pastor. They needed to make sure they were committed to serving. They needed to make sure they were committed to the gospel and committed to living by the Spirit. So those are 3 things that I felt like they would need as they prepare for a new pastor. And so that's kind of how I do that. As far as a one-off goes, man, those are hard. I mean, obviously you pray about them. I use an iPad to preach, so when I used to travel, I would bring like 4 or 5 paper sermons. So I've got 60 pages of paper in the back seat of the truck, and I just pray the whole way there. Now it's a little different. And I'm not trying to be odd here, but I do have somebody drive me to the services. Deacon Keith Ray offers to take me. Tony Kelly has offered to take me. Those individuals, because it's really important. If you're like me, I really don't even want to think about driving when I'm getting ready to preach somewhere else. It's totally different than preaching here. I don't know anybody there most of the time. They've heard about me. They know about me. I don't know them. I try to be really careful when I preach at other places because I know our congregation. I know what our people have gone through. I know different things about their lives. I know what I can say. I know what I can't say. And that doesn't mean I'm going to say anything bad. It just means there are things that I can say to our congregation, and our congregation knows my heart. Well, they don't. They just know that I'm some whippersnapper young preacher that has showed up at their church with flaming, flying hair, and usually the reputation I have on the road is energy. And so most of them aren't used to that. So,
Yeah.
I have to be really careful to keep that at bay, which is really hard for me to do while still being myself. And so preparing for a homecoming, I've never preached a homecoming before other than at Mount Ebal. So when I do that on October the 6th at Pelham First Baptist in Greer, I really got to pray about that. Most of the time, Alan, when I do a one-off, it's whatever sermon I preached most recently. That's really what it is. Whichever one is closest to my heart. In other words, I'm probably not going to pull a one off that I preached 2.5 years ago. I'm not going to remember that. That's kind of what I do. Another thing that I do to prepare to preach other places is I always ask the pastor several questions. And what's really interesting, I mentioned earlier that back in the day and even still today, a lot of guys get revivals because they're friends with people. That doesn't really happen to me. I'm pretty young, so I don't have as many connections as other guys do. All I can say is it's the Lord. I get calls from all across the state, random people I've never heard of, and say, hey, can you come here? And I want our people to know, I don't say yes to every revival. I say yes to some. If they're local, they got a better chance of me saying yes, like Samaria this week. And also, I'd already turned them down 3 times. The only reason I turned them down is the other weeks they had asked me 3 previous years I wasn't available. I was already doing a revival. And so that's kind of how that goes. So most of the people that ask me, I don't know them. They either find out through the convention. For some reason, the convention has my name and they send it out. The association has my name and send it out. Don't know why, but that's kind of how that happens. And so word of mouth. And I do think, the reputation, we do live in a society of preachers where you don't find a lot of energy anymore. And I do think that is one of the reasons you have a revival, is to re-energize your congregation. So if you can get a young guy that can really kind of be a different speed.
Yeah, yeah.
If I'm explaining that, okay.
Yeah, that makes good sense. A lot of times we think that we're so used to what we're used to. We get comfortable in our surroundings, and so sometimes we feel like or at least we should feel like we need to be shaken up a little bit.
Yeah.
And that gives a pastor an opportunity. I imagine if you were going to invite somebody here to do a revival, you would not tell them what to preach.
Nope.
But you could make them aware of certain
Yeah.
things happening in the life of the church. Just like you mentioned Samaria and their pastor having a trial sermon
Yep.
for a pastor
Yep.
the following Sunday. This is a great opportunity to prepare them
Yeah.
for that and how they react to that.
And I think it's important too, not to interrupt you. I think it's important. I've got messages on elder, qualifications of a pastor, what a pastor should do, all that stuff. I think the job of the revival preacher is not to come in and tell the church what to do. That's the pastor's job. I think the job of the revival preacher is to come in and help them recalibrate on what really matters, preach a gospel-centered message, and really make it applicable to them and how they can continue to reach their community. That is my goal in revival preaching. In other words, I'm not going to go into a church. I don't know their finances. I don't want to know their finances. I'm not going to preach one of my 3 messages I have on giving. I'm not going to do that. Not going to do that. And so that I just don't feel comfortable with that. Another thing that I do every time I preach a revival or go anywhere else to preach is I ask, what is acceptable for me to wear? Because I want to wear whatever the pastor that it usually preaches here, whatever he wears. I know for me at our church, some weeks on Wednesdays I might have on a polo. On Sundays I might have no tie and a button down or a tie. It doesn't really matter here. Here, there's not really an expectation for dress, which is a good thing. There was when I first came, but that has changed, and that's been a good thing. But some other places, there is that expectation. The second question I'll ask is, what translation is your congregation prefer? What are they used to? Especially down in the South, a lot of them are King James, so you got to be ready to do that. And for me, that's really hard, but I don't want to be a turnoff to the congregation because of my translation. So that's usually a thing I'll ask. And then the other thing I'll ask is the average age of the congregation. Most congregations I preach at, they are senior adult heavy. That's not here at First Baptist, but other places that I go. And then I ask, where have you been leading them recently? So sometimes they're topical preachers and they can't really tell me because they've been
all over
everywhere. But if they're expository like we are here and they preach book by book, hey, I've been preaching through Proverbs, or hey, I've been preaching through Mark or whatever, then I know I need to stay away from that because that's his. So I'll go somewhere else.
Well, that makes good sense. I remember when we used to do revivals every night of the week, and I remember somewhere along the way we quit doing Friday nights.
Oh, yeah.
Usually because Friday nights were, particularly in the fall, were high school football nights, and that was kind of a thing in a smaller rural community. That was kind of a big deal. That was cheap entertainment.
Oh yeah. And everybody on the field. Usually.
Yeah, and a lot of families that were in church had kids that played
or cheered or whatever.
Right. So I can remember when that. And then I remember it going down to Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday.
And I think one thing, too, so I do have a lot of people ask me, why don't we have a guaranteed revival service every year here at First Baptist? Like, we know that week's going to be revival. My thing is, I don't really like scheduling revivals because I think that's something God has to do.
Right.
And I think that's something that if we need to do it, He'll lay on our heart. And we did that this year with Homecoming. The other thing that the congregation doesn't really understand, and that's okay, but one thing that my preaching style is hard to begin with. And so if I get a hardcore revival preacher and you're already used to me, It's going to be difficult. And what I mean by that is, that preacher's going to come in and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, we just had 5 Sundays in 1 week. Well, that's not a revival. That's you worn out, right? And
Yeah.
so I think you have to know your own style. Now, if I was more monotone and I was more,
Slower.
yeah, then maybe that would work. And maybe as I get older, I've even noticed last 3 years, I have gotten a little bit more like that. And that happens. For example, it was really good to bring somebody in like Bill Pauling. He's a good one to bring in. Somebody a little bit great preacher, a lot different style than me.
Right.
Because when I preached for him yesterday morning at Mount Ebel on top of preaching last night, because he's in Alaska this week, and they come in and they're like, "Oh my gosh, you got to slow down," ramped up, but that's not Bill's style. And so it's good to have different people come in that are different than you.
Well, let me ask you this: in terms of revivals, does that and how does that change how you prepare for us?
Yeah.
Wednesday still happens and Sunday still happens
Oh
here,
yeah.
along with all the other various meetings that you're part of.
Yeah,
How does that
discipleship
work
groups.
out?
Yeah, this week in particular has been really hard. I don't know if it's because of the full moon this week, but I know this week I've been getting pulled in a lot of different directions by our congregation, and it's just hard to keep up. I can't do everything, and I've tried to delegate that to deacons, but some people aren't very understanding with that. So it does make it difficult. And I think the thing about preparing sermons is not only do you have counseling and different stuff like that, sometimes, especially this week with counseling, I've said, hey, I just can't do it this week. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not trying to be ugly. I just can't make it work because I still have to prioritize, because this week in particular, I have discipleship groups that I have to prepare. I'm writing my own curriculum for that class. Sunday morning's got to be prepared. And then also this week, Sunday night with Deacon ordination. And so I think for me, I really try to prioritize that study time. And I definitely, when it gets time to come back to First Baptist, I get excited because I'm more comfortable. This is my wheelhouse.
Right.
As I said at Sunday, this is where I want to be. This is where I feel loved. This is where I feel accepted. But as far as the sermon prep, it is extremely difficult to be able to do that. That's just where I have to ask the congregation to be able to be understanding, work with me, and be flexible.
Well, I think, sometimes you go out on a limb and you say stuff, but I really believe that I'm not out on a limb when I say our congregation loves you and think that we can work with that. Sometimes we forget how fortunate we can be because we get this good preaching pretty much all the time. Not everybody has access to that. We don't know the state of hardly any other churches in our area because, well, most of the time we're here
Yeah.
rather than out
Well,
there and
and I
knowing what's
think
going on.
I think it gives the church a little ownership. So a lot of the time, pastors will call me and say, "My church needs help with X, Y, and Z. Can you come and preach a revival?" Like the pastor I'm preaching for this week, he said they need a spark. They need something before they get a new guy in here. So I think it gives our church a little bit of ownership. Like, hey, we're able to help other churches by sharing our preacher, so to speak. But at the same time, it's a lot of fun because a lot of people from our church either A, ride with me out there, or B, show up. So they take a lot of ownership in that. As I mentioned last Wednesday night, one thing that our church needs to be reminded of, and this has nothing to do with revivals, this is me being the preacher inside of me, we really need to work on not being selfish.
Well,
And that's all of us.
right. I understand that, and we need to understand that we pay you and we take care of you, but you don't really work for us.
That's right.
You're working a little above us. Say that the old saying that it's a little above our pay grade.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're working way above our pay grade.
Well,
And
I mean,
sometimes we need to remember that you have a higher calling.
Yeah.
And the other verse that comes to mind is, to whom much is given, much will be required.
Yeah.
And I think that you and I standing side by side in the judgment, you will be judged heavier just based on your call.
Yeah.
And my call.
And I want to I want to make it clear, our church is really supportive of me going, but there's always individuals that say, well, you don't care about me, or you don't do this, you don't do that. Well, that's why we have deacons. Okay, and I encourage people to do that, because if you look at Acts chapter 6, I don't know if I probably won't preach from Acts 6 this coming Sunday night. I did that last year, but if you look at Acts chapter 6, the whole reason that God placed deacons in the church was so that I could go preach. all over.
A lot of times we forget that.
And that's what I'm supposed to do. And when I'm not preaching, what am I supposed to be doing? Studying and leading my own household. And so we need to be reminded of that. So anything else?
What is the one thought you'd like to leave us with?
I think the one thought that I would leave our church with is I love being a pastor, but I was called to preach. I know there's a difference between pastoring and preaching, and I try to do the best I can at pastoring. I think my gift is preaching. That's what God gave me. I'm not saying I'm good at it. I'm saying that's what He made me to do. And pastoring's part of it. I totally understand that, and I try to do my best at that. But at the end of the day, and I've said this since I was 12, I am at my happiest when I'm preaching God's Word. That's where I'm happiest. Not at a ball game, not on the beach, not any of those things. I'm happiest when I'm in a pulpit preaching.
Good for you. I will let you off the hook at this point. I appreciate you being candid with us.
Absolutely.
I appreciate the opportunity to spring some surprises on you. I look forward to doing it again one day.
Hey, we'll have to do it. We just got to find another topic. So, all right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in today. This has been the Menorah Podcast, episode 33. And hopefully we will see you next Thursday for episode 34. And let us know what you think about this episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great Thursday and even better weekend.
Bye-bye, guys.